Well, hi everyone. This is JP and the Radical Adventist Project. All right, so I'm calling this rant, Stop Thinking Your Church is a Business. Now, for some of you, that's going to instantly lead you to like kind of the Creflo Dollar, Osteen kind of area, where you see these very, very successful pastors or religious organizers living off the proceeds of their members. And that's not what I'm trying to get into. What I'm actually wanting to do here is I'm going to unpack this structure, church structure within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, I think when I'm done here, you will find a lot of overlaps with your own congregation. And what I want to propose that there is a fundamental problem in that if we are thinking of our church in the sense of business, then we are doing bad business. And so we have an option. We have a decision we need to make. Either we need to stop thinking of our church like a business, or we need to start reorganizing our church to work functionally like a business, or at least efficiently like a business. So I'm going to talk about three things, all right? I'm going to talk about the structure. I'm going to talk about how pastors are hired to manage and the problems that come from that. And then I'm going to talk about the false reality that is the community church. And that will lead into some productive channels to think about how we can organize and do church differently. First, I just want to say that when we do these kind of comparisons, it's just bad, faulty logic. We're making some false equivalencies here, right? It's the same as when a libertarian attempts to equate the governmental budget procedure with your home economics, right? Your home budget. These are grossly not the same. There is literally like very little that is the same, maybe except for the fact that we have the word budget and we use money. That's probably the only place where there is real similarity. Like, you don't need to balance a government budget when you can make money, right? Like, what does balancing a budget really mean when you are the creator of the currency? See, again, these are false equivalencies. Likewise, to think of the church like a business is also a false equivalency because we have fundamentally different missions. The outcome of a church is not to make a profit, although that may be a result of the work. It's a side effect. The mission of the church is to bring people to the kingdom of God. A business is designed to make a profit for the shareholders, right? So we have two different efforts and attempts. Now, we do things that are similar, and that makes people confused. And because there are some similarities, we sometimes try to apply business rationales with our local church. Now, there are some functional efficiency things that we can do that doesn't necessarily transcribe perfectly into the church world. With that caveat in place, let's look at the structure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So a local church is responsible for bringing delegates to a constituency meeting, and that constituency meeting is where the conference officials are hired, right? And the conference is responsible for electing the union, and then the union for the division, and the division for the general conference. Now, of course, I'm making this oversimplistic. There are delegates that are representative of all the levels when you go to these different levels of governance. But the fundamental structure then affords, through the tithe, the ability for the general conference, the division, the union, and the conference to hire staff, all right? And so there are elected positions, people that they are elected to, and those are paid by the tithe. And then they are allowed to create a budget that allows them to use the tithe to pay for workers, staff, contract labor, things like that to manage the evangelistic work. The local church, on the other hand, is unique because it actually gives up its tithe money to the conference, to these administrative levels. And what happens here is your 10% goes to the storehouse. And principally, this comes back to the local church through campaigns, training, pastoral support, and guidance, right? And so the overall governance of your local church is supposed to be improved by the presence of your conference officials. The way in which the conference supports your local church is by hiring and training pastors. Now, primarily, the pastors are trained in our institutions and the seminaries and stuff, which are separate entities from the General Conference and from the conferences. But the conferences effectively go to these institutions and hire pastors. These pastors are then prayerfully distributed into your local church, right? And so a pastor then is responsible for 2, 3, 5 churches, one church if it's really big. Sometimes you may get 1, sometimes you may get 2. Rarely will you get 3 or 4. You got to be a mammoth church to get something like that. But for the majority of our local churches, you are usually sharing a pastor. Okay, so now your conference support is essentially distilled into your pastor. The pastor is the chair of your board, responsible for not only the ordinances, not only for weekly sermons, not only for your prayer meetings and development of your ministries and discipleship, but also for overseeing the maintenance of the asset that is your local church and any property or things owned by that conference, foreseeing problems and diffusing issues, for making sure that conference initiatives are seen at the local level, and for making sure that the local issues are brought up to the conference, right? And so this pastor is effectively a liaison, and practically and realistically, they are turned into a manager. All right, so that's the structure, and here's a fundamental problem with this structure from a business perspective. You will note that I said that at every administrative level, they are allowed to hire staff, right? And that staff is typically paid from the tithe dollar. The local church, on the other hand, is only getting a pastor paid by their tithe dollars. That pastor is then tasked with managing an unreasonable expectation. They are effectively managing hundreds of volunteers, that is, your membership, you. And because our mission is about spiritual health, not just physical or measurable metrics, they have an unreasonable task here. And furthermore, they're not given staff. Well, sometimes, when the volunteer is available. And you may get a unicorn where you get the elders and the pastor and the deacons and the deaconesses and the ministry leaders, all of these and they're all volunteers, mind you, all on the same page as your pastor, right? If you can, and so the most effective pastors are the ones who are able to convey a vision and get this church engaged and excited about the work that the conference and this pastor is trying to do, right? This is a rarity. You can have a visionary pastor, and then you can have lackadaisical volunteers. And I'm calling myself a volunteer. We're all volunteering, right? We volunteer to the work of the gospel. But because we are volunteering, we have fundamentally, in reality, bigger priorities than our volunteer life. We have to make a living for our family and everything else. And so whether we want to admit it or not, our loyalties are divided. I think Paul talks about this, right? We have a responsibility given by God to make sure that our first priority is our family. Now, back in the day, it used to be easier to intersect your volunteering with your community and your commitment to your church and then your general work life. We essentially constructed through the suburban myth these local churches and then a community around that church. And if we go back even further, it used to be that the church and the community and the town, everything was small enough to where your engagement day to day and then your weekly engagement in your church overlapped significantly. And so your regular life intertwined with your religious life. Today, we are we're so distant geographically. We commute into our local churches. Oftentimes, our local church and the area that it serves, is meant to serve, like geographically, is not representative of the membership that actually attends that church. And so you don't have that community life to religious life intersection. Therefore, it's not as easy to be committed in your practical available volunteer time to all of the nuances that go into creating successful evangelistic models for a local church. And so now you have a pastor who is then beholden to a church that cannot give its commitments as it needs to meet the needs of the community by which it's geographically located. In short, we've effectively elected people, we give them all of God's money, and then they are unable to meet the needs of that local community because of the distance of our own location and the overworking of our pastors. And fundamentally, when we peel back the layers even further, the problem emerges because our administrations have gotten used to being able to hire staffs and do so rightly with the use of the tithe. But there's a stigma with a local church being able to do the same thing. Even though we are all doing the same work, it is not typical for a church to be able to hire ministerial staff for the support of a conference pastor or something like that. If we were to think of the church like a business, or if we just look around at some of the other churches around us that are thriving, you will notice that their committees have invested significant funds into the creation of support staff for a executive pastor. The pastor has pastors, right? The pastor pastors pastors. And those pastors have supporting staff. They all have operational budgets where they can hire people and maintain their work. And you'll find them actually quite connective in the different ministries that they're doing. Okay, so we're not fixing that anytime soon, although this is definitely calling for a need to really look at how we redistribute the tithe. The fact that in order to get a conference to recognize the needs of a local church, that in the past, local churches have withheld the tithe to pressure a conference to get in line with the needs of the community or the church, demonstrates that the structural practice of giving all of the tithe to the conference is not a practical solution. It shows that if we were able to, on the local ground, able to use a portion of the tithe to hire supportive staff to help the elected ministry leaders to do their work, these elected people over the oversight of the boards and elected officials would then be responsible for carrying out the will of the church. And they would be able to commit themselves to this and then actually manage and train volunteers. These are people who are professionals in their work of ministry. And they're on the local ground. And so we would get consistency on the local level. And then you could still have conference pastors pouring into that mold. In fact, it'd be a great training ground for new pastors who would have fully established administrative units on the local level. I think you would see an overarching improvement of metric with just a few percentage points of your tithe kept at the local level. Okay, tangent over. Here is what we can do now. And this is what we need to do at the local church level to really make this make sense. Your pastor can only manage so much, right? In a regular business model, a CEO, and a pastor is not a CEO. I'm going to have to do another rant on that about why we should not think of our pastoral ministries like management, why we are not managers, right? And we could also go into the fact that the majority of managers in this world are terrible managers. Like 80% of people in any industry are not very good at what they do. And there's only like that 20% that really make the entire industry shine, right? And so we got to deal with that result. And that's what we have to work with. That's just the reality of being human. But a pastor can only manage effectively maybe 6 to 10 people, right? Because this is a high-level type of discipleship that we're doing here. Now, there may be small groups that are formed, study groups and things like that, where we can do overall training and development of people, right? But these are small groups that will move and migrate over time. It is intended that the pastor is equipping people so that they can create small units of training and continue to advance personally and grow as they go along, right? To be effective here, these pastors should only be managing 6 to 10 people, 6 to 10 departments or leaders. And you should be meeting with these leaders who then spread into into the local congregation, right? I mean, the pastor's already doing some overlap in meeting with everybody, but you can almost look at the Sabbath as like a weekly business meeting, right? Where you're just meeting with the church and motivationally guiding them into the agenda of the week, of the next week, if we're looking at it like a business. But effectively, what we need to be able to do is limit what kind of ministries a local church is able to do. What we are really trying to do here is we want to focus our local church ministries so that we are doing a few things very well instead of trying to do everything poorly. We cannot continue to multitask our ministries. There is a church that is going to be better at one thing over another. And it is the duty of pastors, us, to lead a church away from this kind of a la carte method of doing evangelism. It is okay to just have a healing ministry. It is okay to just be a praying ministry, to teach people to pray better or to study better or to live their life better or to build their businesses better or to improve their communities better. It is okay to be just one thing. It is actually imperative that we do that, especially in an urban model where we have multiple churches within geographic location of each other serving the same community. So until we can actually reorganize this church to where the local churches get more checks and balances on the use of tithe dollars, the ability to hire based upon a percentage of the tithe for the sake of consistent ministry within a local community, until we get to the time where we start talking about why we actually need all of these different administrative conferences and departments, we can spend the time thinking about what we need at the local church for ministry. What is it that we actually do well and focusing in on that? Better yet, it's high time that we on the local church level stop relying so heavily on our pastors to do the work. And I think a lot of pastors would say amen to that. It isn't the job of the conference to tell the local church what to do. It's the job of the local church to tell the conferences what to do, and they give us the people to equip us to do it. We say we're a healing church, they give us healers. We say we are a Bible teaching church, they give us Bible teachers. We say we are here for the community, they give us activists. That's what the conference should be doing. We are so removed from understanding the giftedness of our own institution, of our own selves as a local church. And that could perhaps go down to our own understanding of ourselves. But if we can start tackling that, and then at least, if we're going to think of our church and make these false equivalencies of our church as a business, at least then we'll actually be functioning like one. If you enjoyed this rant, if you found some nuggets of inspiration or things to challenge you, I would love to see your comments below. As always, like, subscribe. I appreciate the support. Continue to keep this project in prayer. And until next time, blessings.